are human beings with feelings, and we've built lives and all the other things that have gone on. But something bad has happened somewhere. But it's not my fault.
There's single incident trauma, which relates, as the name implies, to a one-off event. Could be a natural disaster, a bushfire, could be a motor vehicle accident, or it could be a single episode of assault. But complex trauma is a different variety. It has very negative impacts across all domains of functioning. It's interpersonally generated generally. And the responses to PTSD and complex trauma are very different.
Probably about 2/3 of the people that enter the mental health system, either as inpatients or outpatients, have a history of childhood physical and/or sexual abuse.
I was put in 2 orphanages for 7 years, and then I was placed into foster care. So I was actually in the care of the services from the age of 3 to the age of 18. And while in the institution and in foster families they would place us with on weekends, both myself and my sister were sexually abused for 3 years by one of those foster fathers.
Complex trauma, the sort of trauma that's cumulative over quite a period of time, usually during childhood. It's trauma that's frequently enacted by people in that child's environment, and it's often a combination of physical, sexual, emotional abuse or emotional deprivation.
I was told that by the priest that I had actually sinned. I knew that I was now a bad person.
Early caretaking relationships are the context in which children develop psychologically, emotionally. They develop their understanding of relationships and how they work. And of course it also shapes their physical development, but particularly brain development.
And everybody would have heard the term fight or flight. It's actually fight, flight or freeze. They're all particular responses to trauma and the attempt to cope with it. If the trauma is not resolved as time goes on, if people can't turn off those fight or flight, freeze responses, then that's when people are in a very problematic situation and are constantly at risk health-wise, both emotionally and physically.
We know that stress-related hormones, things like cortisol, adrenaline, can have a particular impact on the developing brain, but particularly those parts of the brain that are really essential in learning how to cope with fear, how to protect the self, and how to recognise threat.
I became anxious, I started having panic attacks, and I slipped into quite a deep depression. And before I knew it, I was experiencing what I didn't know then, flashbacks. At the time I was in my mid-40s, and I'd be thrown back to being a child of 4, 6, 8, in abject terror, right back in the moment, and it was terrifying.
It may be apparent that somebody's struggling with self-regulation. They may be visibly agitated, they may be shaking, they may be sweating, their pupils may be dilated, which is often what we call hypervigilance. Another sign of trauma is the shutdown response. If someone's not able to regulate, often they will just completely shut down, or what we say disassociate, withdraw. And that's not well understood, and people don't recognise it.
And things still happen that trigger things, but the reactions get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I believe that's what's happened as I've just steadily worked at things and built, as in decreasing some of the negative effects and building some of the positive things in my life.
If as a therapist you understand what's happening in the brain, you also get a lot of information about therapeutic approaches and how to work with somebody.
I had this internal space of guilt and shame, but I wasn't aware of that until I saw myself behaving in ways that I regret. So when I was a teenager, I would be promiscuous. I really suffered guilt and shame for that. I would be drunk, probably, in my teens, and I didn't understand why I would give myself a hard time afterwards.
If we're not able to modulate our own responses and calm ourselves, we will seek that ability from elsewhere, whether it be drugs, whether it be alcohol, whether it be overwork. And when we recognise the underlying purpose of those coping mechanisms, we can respond differently in our treatment.
Somebody may have used drugs and alcohol to survive. Somebody may have used self-harm to survive. They may have used hoarding, various compulsions, various addictions, various behavioural things to survive. But they make sense, like those things have served a purpose to survive. They've had a function.
So we need to actually look at people in the context of their lives, how they've got to where they are now, and then work with people to understand that.
I saw how much I had danced reactively to those childhood experiences. My exposure to men, my promiscuity when I was 16. I'm so free of the reactive spaces which I danced in for many years, which didn't allow me to be me.
Complex trauma is the sort of trauma that's going to impact on one's basic assumptions about life. In fact, the very essence of selfhood, and selfhood is very much determined by things like being able to be in control of your affect rather than your affect in control of you.
Because if you've never known a safe context, if you've been betrayed in personal relationships, if you don't have the capacity to regulate yourself, which is one of the extremely negative effects of complex trauma, that's a very different situation for recovery than someone who basically does have a sense of safety, has had fairly good relationships and is destabilised because of a one-off event.
Living a life where you've grown up experiencing the level of trauma and detachment and abuse that I did, and that you're never really going to be any good for anything or anybody. Please don't tell people that, not directly and not indirectly. So please let your practice be informed by the belief that you think and know that recovery is absolutely possible.
We now know that the brain is not hardwired but neuroplastic, which means that it's capable of regeneration. With the right support, it is possible to recover from trauma. Many complex trauma survivors have gone to health professionals for help and support and unwittingly have been re-traumatised by health professionals who simply didn't have the knowledge about the neurobiological effects of trauma on the brain and body.
Sometimes what we do as clinicians and workers with people can actually act as a trigger for some of these more extreme responses and difficult responses. Building up trust, building up a sense of safety where someone can actually undertake quite a difficult process of seeing someone to talk about psychological or emotional issues can be very frightening and can take some time.
It's not going to take 1 year, it's not going to take 2 years. It's a lifetime of work. Not that I've been in counselling my whole life, but I've had periods where I've done intensive and I moved away.
The organisation Adult Surviving Child Abuse, ESCA, has produced a set of guidelines called the Last Frontier, Practice Guidelines for Treatment of Complex Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care and Service Delivery. So it's very important that health professionals are aware of this material and are trained appropriately.
But the evidence is that there are effective interventions and supports, provided that we do them appropriately at the right time, be informed by what that person needs and work with them.
The staged approach to therapy and treatment is very important for complex trauma, and basically the stages are, the first is safety, stabilisation, very important for people who experience complex trauma to have a safe context. Second one is processing the trauma, and the third is integration of trauma. For a person to attempt to process complex trauma prior to being able to regulate their own internal states would be to trigger again those traumatic fight or flight responses.
Focus on forming trusting relationships. We have to be a safe person. We need to know ourselves, or if we have complex difficulties with people, we need to get supervision about that. We need to share the risk. If there is risk that's significant, we need to share the burden And those are basic practice of good clinical practice.
Doing it with a therapeutic relationship with a counsellor, that made the difference, because then there's a reflective surface, isn't there? And I think that's what really good therapy and counselling should be.
Absolutely possible to recover from a time where, one feels there is no hope. Living a healthy, worthwhile life, absolutely.